I feel like it's outrageous. For that much extra money for this little garage, for $220, I should be able to park my car in this garage, okay?
The ship's approaching Rubicon. Wake up the dogs.
Establishing cerebral-coral connection. Link verified.
Hey there, pilots. This is Noisy Wren, transmitting the Rubicon Dogs podcast from, somewhere out among the stars, bringing you all the Armored Core data you need to survive the battlefield. Let's get to it. What's going on, guys? Welcome to the original, the OG episode of the Rubicon Dogs podcast. Now, for those of you who are not new to this series, we obviously haven't heard news of anything new Armored Core for a long time. It's been 10 years now. 2013 was the last year that we got anything Armored Core related. That was Armored Core Verdict Day. So to say that I am hyped for Armored Core 6 is an understatement. As someone who's played every single Armored Core, starting back with Armored Core 1 on the PlayStation, I never thought we'd get another one. I thought Verdict Day would be the last, and then rumors started circulating, probably 5 or 6 years later that another Armored Core was in the works. But again, unverified rumors. There wasn't any good, sourcing for it. There was no information backing it up. I figured it was just hearsay, and yet, here we are. And From Software delivered this week. They dropped a ton of new information, and so we're going to be working our way through it. But first, I want to start with kind of what Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon is, where it falls in the storyline, etc. So, historically speaking, Armored Cores have fallen into, we'll call them a couple of alternate universes. So while the concept of the world and a lot of the gameplay mechanics and things like that will be very similar to previous titles, the actual kind of mainline storyline will have no direct link to the past Armored Core games, and so you don't have to be, a veteran of the series. You can come into this thing totally fresh, and it will be no issue at all. And so the description they've released for the game is a mysterious new substance was discovered on the remote planet Rubicon 3. As an energy source, the substance was expected to dramatically advance humanity's technology and communication capabilities. Instead, it caused a catastrophe that submerged the planet and the surrounding stars in flames and storms, forming a burning star system. Almost half a century later, the substance has resurfaced on Rubicon 3, a planet now contaminated and sealed off as a result of the catastrophe. Extraterrestrial corporations and resistance groups fight for control of the substance. The player infiltrates Rubicon as an independent mercenary and finds themselves in a struggle over the substance with the corporations and other factions. Now, of course, with several new interviews and a new trailer, they've released a lot more information kind of expanding on this concept. So we know that this new substance is called coral. And there's kind of an interesting line that there's indigenous forces on the planet Rubicon. And so the question here is what they mean by indigenous forces. Is that, people or technology, AI, something like that existed on Rubicon, as of the disaster? Or is that something that existed before that? Is it something that's endemic to Rubicon? Because that would definitely be a shift in your kind of normal enemies for Armored Core. Historically speaking, it's always really been human versus human, or human versus AI, something like that. Kind of other planetary creatures, aliens, things endemic to other planets. Enemies like that, historically speaking, haven't really been much of a thing in Armored Core. And it's interesting as you watch the trailer, there's several things that are glowing red or have red eyes, things of that nature, which I'm assuming is coral related. And so are these things those indigenous forces that they're talking about on the planet? I have a little bit of kind of speculation in that it'll be something similar to kind of a coral-powered, almost AI that is controlling these giant mechanical creatures, and then while humans will be involved, while you'll still be, fighting other corporations and working as a sort of mercenary, I do expect that maybe it falls in line with more of that like human versus AI, except for in this case, the AI in question is sort of an endemic system. Not even sure that's the right word, but yeah, sort of an endemic system to Rubicon. It's also interesting that in the trailer, there's kind of a warning that you're given that there's been a coral response from the generator, which to me seems to indicate that maybe not everything is powered by coral, else wouldn't there be kind of a coral response from every enemy? But maybe it's something that it's kind of a larger response. It's indicating a large incoming attack. And so it sort of serves as a warning system so you can dodge, shield, etc. Not sure just yet. And so I figured we would go through the trailer as well as some of the interviews, things like that, and break it down sort of point by point of things that I feel like are major aspects of the game, or major shifts from the norm, things that I've noticed, speculation, things like that, starting with Human Plus. So in the trailer, they say that you're a modified human, which very much falls in line with the old games. In the first couple, you were essentially a normal human. Pilots were referred to as ravens back at that time. So you're a normal human, and then if you went far enough into debt, you would receive cybernetic enhancements that would allow you to then, it would give you kind of unlocked abilities such as improved regen for your generator, improved radar, the most important probably being able to use back-mounted heavy weapons while moving, which prior to unlocking that ability, bipedal legs, reverse joints, things like that, could not use your heavier cannons and things like that, your back-mounted heavy weapons while moving. So it was a big deal for that. It was a big change in how you played your AC. And then right around Armored Core 4 or so, these became more unlocked bonuses you would get throughout the game or at the end game, something like that. But Armored Core, historically speaking, has always sort of had a human plus aspect to it. Also falling in line with kind of how it's been previously, they've confirmed that the player will not speak. So like the old games, it's kind of a silent protagonist. They've always kind of framed it from your point of view, and so you as the pilot are given missions from other corporations, groups, other pilots, things of that nature, but it's never really something you have to respond to. The sort of mission-based system that they've put in place means you really just get messages from these people that tell you, hey, go do this thing, show up at this place. Very rarely have they put you in a situation where you would even need to respond to another one. Occasionally, maybe some pilots, talking to you during a mission or something, but I feel like it's never really been an issue that you've been a silent protagonist. And so I think that they'll continue with that sort of same line. They've also indicated that the Human Plus, the cybernetic enhancements that you received, affect your emotions. And so I think you'll see a lot of that during the game too. They have said that it affects the actual storyline of the game, that there are implications there. And so I'm curious if it's something that kind of as you go through the storyline of the game, maybe you start to sort of unlock those emotions, you start to feel more, or you dive deeper into that aspect of it. Or maybe you become kind of this cold-blooded killing machine and stick along those lines. I'm not really sure how they'll do it, but they have indicated that it will have more effect on the storyline, which I think is something that's maybe a little bit deeper for this Armored Core versus previous titles. And so I think the next aspect to touch on is sort of the pace of the gaming. what it feels like in comparison to old ones. Boosting specifically plays the biggest role, I think, in the pacing of the Armored Core games. Historically speaking, they've been a little bit on the slow side, so slow, clunky, to turn around, took quite a while. Boosting wasn't even all that fast, and then right around Armored Core 4, I believe, is when they introduced quick boosts, which allowed just quick burst of movements, forward, back, side to side, up. It also allowed boost turning, so historically, it's taken you quite a long time, if something got behind you, to sit there and turn, and that turning speed was affected by, your legs and some of your other parts. But the kind of introduction of quick boost allowed even heavier mechs just to whip around, which changed your gameplay a lot. Being able to quickly dodge side to side really sped up your gameplay. And so Armored Core 4, the battles and the pace was sometimes borderline ridiculous. And don't get me wrong, I love Armored Core 4. I love the really quick, fast-paced, finger twitch nature of it all. But it was much, much faster than the other games. And then as we moved into Armored Core 5 and Verdict Day and that kind of generation, even though they kept a lot of those quick boost and quick turn aspects, they really slowed it down a lot in comparison to how it was before. And so they have confirmed that Armored Core 6 is going to fall kind of somewhere in the middle between ACs 3 and 5. And that's good. I think Armored Core 5, in comparison to Armored Core 4, I think it felt a lot more in line, I guess is the right word, with other mech games. It felt a lot heavier. It felt a lot kind of slower in some regards. You still got the quick boost. You still got the quick turn, things like that. But Armored Core 4 and that generation was very floaty, very kind of twitch, reflex, fast-paced. And Armored Core 5, I felt like brought a lot more heaviness to it, and it made it feel a little more intentional and just more in line with what I feel like a kind of a mech combat simulator-ish game should be. While Armored Core 4, probably something closer in line with Daemon Ex Machina or something like that. And so I think Armored Core 6 will end up finding this kind of perfect balance between the heaviness and that sort of mech realism, for lack of a better word, between that of Armored Core 5 and then the floaty, twitch-based kind of fast combat of Armored Core 4. So I'm definitely excited to see where they go with that. And I think pacing of combat has been a big aspect for them as they've gone through the interviews and trailers. They've talked a lot about the changing pace of combat, whittling down your opponent, or waiting for these openings, and then suddenly bursting in to take advantage of those openings. And so I think we'll see that. I think overall it'll be a little bit slower than Armored Core 4. And so as these openings happen, then you'll be able to, boost in and really do some damage quickly. In reference to that, they've talked about a new thing called Assault Boost. And so in previous titles, you had kind of your regular boost, so to say, and then you had Overt Boost and Quick Boost. And so your Quick Boost were these kind of short side-to-side, front and back dodging almost motions, which would use a higher amount of energy than your normal boosting would, but were kind of, quick. And then you have your Overboost, which was this big thrusting boost that would drain your generator very rapidly, but allow for very quick motion forward or to the side. With the new game, they've talked about Assault Boost, which I think will be kind of somewhere in a line between the two. So I think it'll be more distance covering than your Quick Boost, but probably not as much build up as your Overboost, probably not as long lasting. So I even though they haven't really gone into detail about it, I feel like it will be this kind of high powered boost forward that will launch you all the way to your opponent to make use of melee weapons, close combat things, shotguns, etc. But I think it won't be as draining as the Overboost, but I'm sure we'll use more energy up than your typical boosters would. And I think it'll be this kind of flow of combat back and forth between your regular boost and moving, around the perimeter and working your way in, and then capitalizing on those openings with your assault boost. They've also talked about a posture break mechanic, similar to that of what you'd see in something like Sekiro. And so historically speaking, we've never really had a posture break. Armored Core has always had a stagger mechanic, and so if your weapon hit hard enough, it would kind of stagger your opponent, and so they would very quickly, lose their boost or sort of be staggered in place, not able to shoot, something like that. And it only lasts for, maybe a split second, but it was definitely something that you could capitalize on, depending on what sort of weapons you used. And as we moved into Armored Core 5 and that generation, you saw a thing called Armor Break, which was along the same lines, except for it would allow you to stagger an opponent, and then it would drop their defense if you did enough of that stagger damage in quick succession. It would drop their defense by, I believe it was 20%, and so it would allow these smaller mechs to go and really do damage to your tanks and your heavily armored things. Even though they were using smaller weapons, you could armor break them and then get that 20% damage bonus, depending on what you had equipped. So I feel like the new tactic will be to posture break them and then assault boost in and take advantage of that opening to do heavier damage. Whether they'll keep the defense drop of the armor break system, I'm not sure, but I think it is an interesting gameplay mechanic in that regard. Related to your boosters, you have your primal armor, which historically speaking has run on kind of the same energy as your boosters, which was Kojima particles back in the day. They have confirmed that that's not going to be the case any longer, and so I imagine it will be something based on this kind of coral energy that you have now. And so just like you see in the trailer, your primal armor is this sort of barrier that comes up around you that will lessen the damage depending on what you're being shot with. It comes up as this kind of green glow, this green ball around your AC. And you do see that in the trailers. And along with that, you have assault armor, where you overload your generator and it blows out this huge ball of energy around you. And they have confirmed that you still have assault armor. And even though I imagine it will still do damage like it did in the previous games, I think in this one it might more play a role in that posture break system. They have talked about using it to break your enemy's posture and then, assault boosting in and attacking them. So I think it'll be, kind of a trade-off, right? So historically, it'll take off that shield for a set amount of time. And so it's this big trade-off of I do extra damage, I'm up close and in their face, but if I don't finish them off, then I lose that primal armor for a set amount of time. And I expect that they'll keep that same sort of mechanic going in this one. I think there'll definitely be that trade-off. And so the next big aspect, I think, to cover that plays off that mobility are the legs of your AC. And so in previous games, there have always been multiple options of legs to choose from, and it heavily affects how your Armored Core will handle, operate, the things you can equip, and to some extent, even the things you can do with certain weapons. And it sounds like they were putting a lot of effort in the Armored Core 6 to diversify them even more, which I think is a great thing. They're already fairly diverse, but there were some things that definitely worked better than others, and depending on what weapons you wanted to play with would more kind of lock you into certain legs. And so I think diversifying them even more can only help. But I think we just go through them one by one, and I'll give you my thoughts and some things that we've noticed. Not that we saw all leg types, presumably. So tank treads are the first one. So they're the heavy, high armor point. So armor points are kind of like your life points. Essentially, it's the defense of your mech, the life that it has. That's what's whittled away gradually, right? It's your armor points. And so for tank legs, they're always heavy and have high AP. Depending on the game, they would have what you'd call hangers. And so hangers are something that hold on to backup weapons, so you can drop your main weapons, and then out of these hangers pull out smaller weapons. Historically, it's usually been things like pistols or blades, something like that, depending on the legs you have equipped. But in later generations, tanks had the ability to equip almost anything in their hangars. And I don't know if they'll keep that sort of hanger mechanic. There's one on your back that we'll touch on later that we do know about, but as far as the kind of in-leg or shoulder-mounted hanger system of some of the previous games, we don't know. But tanks were special in the fact that they had really high stability and that you could use your back weapons while moving, which things like your bipedal legs, your reverse joints, most of your other leg types could not do. If you used a heavy back weapon, they would have to crouch down and fire it. And it wasn't usually your missiles. It was usually things like back-mounted chain guns, rail guns, bazookas, things like that, your really heavy, hard-hitting weapons. But tanks had the ability to use those while moving and do so with really good stability and accuracy, which is what really set them apart in addition to their high defense. And so in 6, you see this tank bust in and ram through some of its opponents, blowing them up. So I definitely think this sort of ramming melee attack with the tank legs will be an aspect of it. And there's some legs later that we'll chat about that also seems to have, I guess you'd call it a melee attack. And this is something I personally expect to see out of all the legs. I think that they're going to give all of them a melee attack of their own. We do see the reverse joints later had like boost in and had this sort of clawing foot kick attack. So I do personally predict that they're going to give each of the legs a unique melee attack to combo in with the rest of their attacks and weapons and things. The tank treads in this one also get a drift, which is interesting. You see it in the trailer. He kind of drifts around this like boosting slide, which you've always been able to boost, sideways and do the quick turns that I talked about earlier. But this sort of drifting dodge and repositioning is definitely new, and I think something that's going to set the tank legs apart. If I had to guess, they'll be more ground combat oriented, which has pretty much been the case historically in a lot of ways because of how heavy and slow moving they are. The boosters didn't move them as much as your lightweights, and so they've always been more, I think, ground focused. So I definitely expect that to continue. So next up on our list are the quad legs. Previously, you may hear people refer to them as spider legs, which is, not entirely accurate. There's only 4, so they're missing a few there. But your quad legs historically have allowed things like using the back weapons while moving in some games. They're usually a little bit more energy efficient than the tank legs, not necessarily kind of a high armor and stability like they are. So they're this sort of in between your bipedal and your tanks. In this one, we do see this sort of double jump maneuver that they do, followed by hovering in the air and just raining bullets down. And I think that is going to be its mobility move that is unique to the quad legs in this one, is that sort of hovering, floating maneuver. And I imagine it won't take a lot of energy to maintain, unlike what I would expect from the other legs, where it'll require more energy, more of your generator to sit and hover like that, and also probably won't be nearly as steady. So I think there'll probably be some aspect of, recoil and stability that the quad legs have advantage of in the air. And so I definitely think that they're going to be your maintained aerial combat leg choice. Which brings us to our next type of legs, which are the reverse joints. We do see these in the trailers too. They've been a personal favorite of mine. I've always leaned more into lightweights and super lightweights, and so the more kind of maneuverable leg types have always been a favorite. Reverse joints allow you to jump quite far without really having to use your boost, and so you get this sudden vertical acceleration, which is really useful for dodging. It's really useful for energy efficiency. A lot of the times they tend to be maybe a little bit less defensive than your other bipedal legs, but the trade-off being you get more stability out of them sometimes, you get more vertical maneuverability. And so if you want kind of more quick-paced, hopping aerial combat, the reverse joint legs have always been the way to go. And in this one, we see this sort of jumping claw kick that they do in the trailer, which I'm assuming is a reverse joint specific melee attack. So just like the tanks have that ramming maneuver, I think that this is a reverse joint specific kind of jump in, claw, kick them. Again, kind of leaning into that expectation that each leg type will have both a melee attack and sort of something new maneuverably. I don't know what it's going to be for the reverse joints. I do expect it'll be something jumping related. In some of the later generations, you could do things with, especially with bipedal legs, but with anything, you could jump off the side of buildings and use a little bit less boost. So you're sort of Mega Manning your way through the level, right? So that would be maybe an interesting aspect, since there seems to be more verticality in these maps and something larger, would be to give reverse joints the ability to kind of hop off of different things and provide a little bit more maybe horizontal maneuverability as opposed to just the vertical leap. But I am curious where they'll go with it. One thing that's interesting to touch on here is during the trailer, the second trailer, the most recent kind of gameplay footage that we see, we do see a AC go onto this sort of lit platform, or it's a platform that has these kind of lasers shooting into the sky, these kind of markers, right? And then the AC just launches into the air. And so, historically speaking, the reverse joints were the legs that could do that from anywhere, right? They just had a really high vertical jump. But in this one, they've talked about expanding the maps, much bigger maps, much more verticality to them. And so I'm curious if we have these new sort of jump platforms that will allow your heavier mechs to kind of launch up, either to get into the air or to get to different levels of the area. I think in a lot of ways it sort of looks like what Spirit Springs from Elder Scrolls, and so you just kind of walk into them, press a button, and get launched skyward. So I'm curious if that's something to make up for your heavier mechs and your tank legs, things like that, since it'll be hard for them to get up. And along with that, I'm kind of curious on the verticality of this game. And so around 4th generation, boosting, staying in the air was a huge aspect, and certainly there was ground combat, but it wasn't hard to launch yourself upwards or to maintain a lot of aerial time. And I'm curious if they decreased that in this one, if it is just a little bit more ground focused, or if it really depends on the leg type that you're using, or how these will play into the game. And of course, we see your mech with the bipedal legs, so it's your typical humanoid 2 legs, and they don't really show a lot of any unique aspect of them in the trailers, so I'm not sure what they'll do here. Historically, they haven't been maybe anything special. They've been kind of this middle ground of maneuverable, but also good stability, a lot of different kind of weight classes that you can put them in, good armor. And so they've been kind of this jack-of-all-trades leg type, which I expect that they still will be, but I'm curious what kind of uniqueness they'll bring to the table for the bipedal legs. And so one thing we might see, though I doubt it, are hover legs. And so for those of you who haven't played the previous generation of games, you used to not be able to just hover and boost over water. And so the hover legs were introduced, I believe, Armored Core 2, and then they were omitted sometime around the 4th generation, but they allowed you to hover over water. They performed in a lot of ways, like the tank legs, allowing, use of back-mounted weapons, things like that, but they tended to be much lighter weight. They didn't hold nearly as much. In fact, usually they would hold less than even bipedal legs, things like that. But they were sort of this quick, maneuverable option that were similar to the tank legs. I don't expect we'll see them. I think they were really introduced just for that hovering over water ability as we started to see, more water in the levels. But yeah, in later generations, they just had an auto boost feature where all of your mechs and leg types could just auto hover above the water, which I definitely think is the right move game design wise. But it would be interesting if they brought them back and gave some kind of uniqueness, or if they give us an entirely new leg type. And I don't know what that would be. You could do like a rolling ball, something like that. But I do wonder if that takes away from sort of this, I don't know if you'd call it realism, but this sort of based in reality aspect that Armored Core has always had. I do wonder if that would take away. I mean, a rolling ball or something like that definitely isn't out of the question. You could do something, I don't know, snake-like. There's definitely lots of leg type options out there, but I don't know if it would fit in with kind of the normal historical aesthetic of the game. But who knows if they'll go with that or not. They might show us something entirely different. It would certainly be out of the box and something very unique to Armored Core 6 if they did. So I think there's an interesting aspect, an interesting piece of the trailer that people, for the most part, haven't really touched on, and that's that during one of the boss fights, specifically, I believe it's the one with that mech that has the giant kind of grinder arms, we do see our AC switch to its back right-mounted weapon, and then fire it while moving through the air, and it looks like a fairly heavy weapon, a sort of cannon or bazooka or rocket, something like that. So whether it falls in that sort of class of weapons of like rockets per se that you didn't necessarily have to crouch for before, or whether this is an aspect of being that kind of already augmented human, in that unlike a lot of the previous games, you don't have to crouch fire heavy back weapons and that you can just whip out a cannon and shoot it while moving with bipedal legs, I think will be an interesting thing to see moving forward, because it's always sort of been this staple of the game, that weapons, heavy back-mounted weapons, were something you would have to crouch fire for unless you equipped like tanks or one of your heavier leg types, which I think was interesting, right? It gave a lot of kind of specific diversity to the tank legs while limiting the abilities of some of the lighter sort of AC leg types to use those really big, heavy weapons. And so I'm curious in this one, is it a sort of human plus situation where you just start out with that ability? Is it something you unlock as you work your way through the game? Or maybe that weapon type doesn't fall into that category despite being rather big. Maybe it's just like a rocket or something you don't really have to lock on to aim, something that doesn't have a lot of recoil that you don't have to crouch fire. I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting thing to think on, right? Because if from the base game you can just backfire these heavy weapons that previously you can't, it's definitely a big different starting experience to this game versus the previous games. Even though it's something I think you could pretty much always unlock. It wasn't how you started, and it always played sort of a role in your build, especially early on. Another thing I'm curious if we get are weapon arms. And so previously, you had your normal humanoid arms that would hold, guns, blades, things of that nature. But in addition to that, they always had weapon arms, which would be like double Gatling guns, double blades, cannons, missiles, things like that. It was weapons that entirely took off your arms and equipped a weapon, an arm-mounted heavier weapon. And it was usually stuff that would normally equip onto your back that would require you to crouch, or things that would be very heavy, or things that had, a massive amount of ammo, something like that. There's always this trade-off, right, of they tend to be very good weapons, but it limits your ability to then equip two separate weapons on your arms, or to be able to, unhanger weapons, purge weapons, things like that. But I think it was good in a lot of ways, especially for more lightweight, maneuverable mechs to get, harder hitting, heavier weapons in there without having to do the crouch mechanic. So weapon arms are definitely something I expect we'll see. I think they've always been in the series. From Armored Core 1, they're something that I personally really love, and I think it makes a really unique looking AC as well. So I definitely expect that we'll see weapon arms make a return, though they haven't shown us any yet. They've also talked about shields, and so shields are something that have kind of come and gone in different formats throughout Armored Core. And so, of course, you have your later generation primal armor that will also exist in this one. But shields have been something that historically you could equip onto originally your arms and then eventually your shoulders. And they've done everything from just reducing specific damage types incoming. So you'd have shields that were good against physical damage that will just drop the overall damage you take. They've had shields that have, I guess, like their own health bar, essentially. So they have their own kind of armor points when you have them up, and then eventually, they'll break as those armor points are decreased to 0. And so those shields would take, most if not all of the damage that your core would take instead. So I think there's a lot of options of what they do with shielding in this one, and we do see one in the trailer. We see this back-mounted shield kind of spring out, and it shows almost what looks like a primal armor sort of barrier around him. But right when the AC is about to be hit, we suddenly see this back shield deploy. And back shielding, if I'm remembering correctly, is entirely new to the series, so having a back-mounted shield. And I expect that it'll make some interesting builds, depending on how it works. And I'm curious, too, with the addition of all the different melee attacks, of the assault boosting in, the kicking with the legs, things like that, if they'll have some other aspects to the shields, too. So maybe it blocks and then, shoots a certain amount of damage kind of back out in front of it, or does some sort of damage within a radius around it, deflects bullets, something like that. I'm curious if the shields will be expanded on at all and sort of how they'll function in this game, but they haven't really gone into a lot of detail about it yet. And so another thing we see in the trailer and that they talk about a little bit is scanning. And so it's a mechanic that was introduced in Armored Core 5, which you could flip into the scanning mode, start to see most enemies through walls. You could lock onto things behind walls sometimes. And so you could see them. While you're in the scanning mode, it would pull up a lot of information, things like, defense, what they're weak against, armor, points that are left, things like that. And I think in a lot of ways, it was very interesting. It was very fitting in line with this futuristic environment and game. But I think in a lot of ways, I didn't like the scanning mode too. It was something where your generator output, your refresh rate would increase when you're in scanning mode. And so there was always this constant flipping back and forth between, kind of your attack, your regular mode, and this scanning mode, which I didn't like personally. I would rather just stay in the kind of single mode, or lack thereof, of the previous games, but have this sort of scan implemented. I think it would be an interesting option to base, your FCS, your fire control system, your head, maybe your radar, things like that. I think it would be an interesting aspect if those played heavily into the scanning aspect. And so you could do things like snipers and things that could scan way ahead, get information. And then you could have other heads that maybe locked on quicker, had much shorter range, quicker orienting, things like that maybe didn't have as much scanning ability. Which has all historically been true. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, all of that has always been an aspect of AC. I just think it would be interesting if they really leaned into it more and then did away with the scanning mode so we didn't have to just constantly flip back to it when we were out of combat. I think it just kind of takes you out of the moment a little bit. And that's something that they really seem to be leaning into on this one. They've talked about, the focus is more on capitalizing those opportunities and really observing your opponent, and less so maybe on some of the more management aspects that Armored Core has had previously. And so I think maybe it's a natural progression to include the scanning ability, but kind of take away the scanning mode from Armored Core 5. But we'll definitely see where they go with it. And so another big aspect to touch on, of course, are your weapons themselves, what you can equip and kind of where you can equip it. So in historical games, you had your arm weapons, and then your back weapons were sort of these separate things. And then somewhere in the middle, they allowed the ability to equip arm weapons on your back and to rotate between them. And so it's kind of this carousel-like effect of, you'd put we'll say your left-hand gun onto your back and then pull out another weapon that you're storing back there, with the trade-off being that you couldn't equip, back missiles or cannons or either other kind of back-mounted weapons. You would exchange that ability for this hanger system, which it does sound like they've confirmed is returning, which I think is great. I think if you're more kind of hand weapon focused and you don't need a lot of these back options, which are usually things like missiles or heavier cannons, if you want more rifles, more machine guns, more ammo in that regard, I think that it's a great option to have these back-mounted hanger kind of carousel options. And so some of the other games also had a sort of secondary hanger in which you could keep blades or handguns, or even bigger weapons, depending on what type of legs you were using. I'll be interested to see if they include those as well, or if that's something that they take out entirely, since they have the back hanger system in there as well. One thing I definitely think they'll keep is purging weapons. And so previously, if you ran out of ammo, or if you didn't need a weapon for any particular reason, you could purge it, which is just kind of throwing it off onto the ground, and then it'll be recovered at the end of the mission. And it was useful in that you no longer had to worry about managing that weapon. You didn't have to worry about, clicking the fire button and nothing coming out of it. It would drop a lot of your weight, which was great. And so every weapon you purged, you'd get a little bit faster. As well as every weapon seems to lock on just a little bit differently or at different ranges. And so you wouldn't have to worry about, your FCS trying to lock on for that weapon, even though you couldn't fire it. I expect that they'll keep purging in here. And it's something previously you had an auto purge feature that you could turn on, which was great, or you could also manually purge off your weapons if you didn't need them or if they're in the way for some reason. But there are kind of two things in the trailer that stood out to me weapon-wise. Well, one's in the trailer and one I think came from an interview. The first being that blade weapons, and your melee weapons in general, it sounds like, are now relegated to the left arm, which is interesting. Historically, in, probably the first half of Armored Core games, maybe even farther, your blades and your melee weapons, which included other things like pile bunkers, solid blades, pulse blades, things like that, they were always relegated to your left arm. And then somewhere along the line, they allowed you to start equipping them on your right side. I believe it was towards the later 4th generation or maybe Armored Core 5. But they started allowing you to equip them on either side, which makes sense to me. You can equip pretty much all guns on one or the other. It doesn't really matter. But they have confirmed in Armored Core 6 that your melee weapon is locked to your left side. And I'm not entirely sure why they did it, whether it's an intentional design choice for building your AC and preventing, maybe your double blade dashing, which was something you could do. Historically, your blades have always had this sort of dash towards opponents you're locked onto or that were within your FCS. You'll dash forward and attack. And so if you had a blade on each hand, you could kind of dash with one blade and then dash with the next. I don't know if they want to stop that in exchange for assault boosts and stop the double equipping of melee weapons. I don't know if it's something that they feel like their melee weapons are powerful enough that you could abuse if you could equip one on each side. But even then, they could limit it to just having one equipped, whether it was on your right or your left. I'm not sure why they went back to the left-hand melee weapon equip. And it's something they've done historically, though I don't really know the reason then either. Maybe it's easier on the animation team as far as, they've said that a lot of these melee weapons, or potentially every melee weapon, will have a unique animation, which I think would be great if every single blade was unique. Well, they're not even blades in this one, but if every single melee weapon had a unique sort of animation and movement to it, which has been sort of true in the past. There's been blades that did have unique movements, or that would, if they always swing from kind of the center outward, you'd have one that might swing from the out. You might have one that swings from kind of the outside in, or more vertically, more horizontally. There is even a shooting blade that sort of you kind of punched forward a little bit and it would shoot out this laser, arc in front of you. And so I don't know. As it stands now, I'm not a huge fan of putting melee weapons only on the left side after they had more or less just given us the ability to equip them on either side. But it's not a huge deal. I'll be interested to see why it's that way and what we can do with it for sure. The one thing I'm definitely excited about is the diversity and uniqueness of the melee weapons in this one. And so we know we have the pulse blades, I believe are confirmed. They've talked about the pile bunkers, which are this kind of maybe explosion-powered spike that shoots out. Previous games had physical blades. Maybe they'll keep those in. I sort of expect they will with the amount of unique weapons they have. They've talked about a chainsaw, which I think is awesome. Pulse blades again. They've talked about a laser lance. I'm sort of curious if what we see in the trailer is that laser lance. So we see this thing that I can't quite tell if it's an AC or an MT, which previously MTs were like your kind of standard enemy, right? So it's a muscle tracer. And so it was your kind of non-boss, non-AC, not even non-boss, just non-AC enemies. And so I don't know what they'll be called in this one, if they'll keep the MT theme. But yeah, it's your sort of non-vehicle, non-AC enemy. But yeah, so we see this enemy with this big laser lance. It kind of charges up and dashes forward, misses once and then swings around and does it again and impales the AC on this long, energy pulse lance. And it's interesting that it's got this big back-mounted sort of booster system equipped to it as well, which maybe leads me to believe it's not another AC. I'm not entirely sure. There are things like in Armored Core 5 and Verdict Day, you would get ultimate weapons, or overt weapons, I think they're called in Japanese. So you'd get these big ultimate weapons that would take up your back slots. And there was a thing, I think it was called the Mega Blade, which is in line with this. It was a long energy blade that had this back-mounted kind of bulbous booster generator thing equipped. And so it looks similar, I think, in a lot of ways to what we see in the Armored Core 6 trailer. So it would be interesting if they had more powerful melee weapons with things like built-in shields, built-in booster systems, things like that, that would take up additional weapon slots. It would be interesting if they had dual hand-mounted weapons. I don't know that they will. They've talked about them only being equipped on the left side. So I don't really expect it, but it would certainly be an interesting aspect if they did. And we've seen other things in the first trailer. You see this kind of cluster bomb thrower in front of you, and I don't know that that necessarily counts as a melee weapon. And we've had things like cluster bombs and rockets and things that weren't specifically aimed or kind of targeted in previous games, and so they were sort of fired manually. And I think that's kind of what we see with the cluster bombs, but they're short range enough, maybe you can kind of lump them in with the melee weapons. We also see this sort of spinning polearm blade that our AC uses, and so it sort of unfolds into this double-sided spinning blade that he uses to take out the, I believe it's the booster, the engine of one of the large boss enemies, if memory serves. And so that one definitely looks awesome too. Again, it's another unique melee weapon. And just a little bit on that sort of destroying that piece of the boss, whether it destroyed all of it or not, I'm not sure. But there are a few games in which you could destroy certain pieces of ACs, and so you could somewhat disable their legs, you could blow off an arm or a head or things like that, which would obviously incapacitate the weapons on that side. While I don't necessarily know that they'll continue that in this game, I feel like maybe we would have already seen it. It would be an interesting aspect if you could lose certain weapons or certain parts to damage individually as opposed to just the entire core. And so I don't know. I don't know if they will or not, but it would be an interesting gameplay option for sure. Another interesting aspect could be going back to that blade dash before. I expect we'll see something akin to that sort of forward dashing, forward momentum from most of our melee weapons. But I'm curious, like the pile bunker, for example, there wasn't much of a forward dash with that. You had more, it had like a charge animation, so you'd pull back your fist, charge it, and then it would punch forward. There's a little bit of forward momentum, but not nearly the dash, the kind of locked on approaching dash that the blades have. And so I'm curious if the assault boost system could be linked into the melee weapons at all. Would be an interesting aspect. I don't actually expect that's the case. I imagine they'll keep it in there for people who want to use like double shotguns and things like that too, or just the melee attack of your legs themselves. But I'm curious if there are any forward dashes linked to the melee weapons in this one, like there have been previously. So that feels like the perfect segue to kind of bring us into lock-on and your fire control system, your camera controls, things of that nature. So historically, your older Armored Core games had, you always have your fire control system is one of your parts that's equipped, but it would adjust this sort of screen within your screen, this sort of rectangular reticle, where if your enemies are inside that, you could lock onto them, and if they were out of it, then you just sort of free fired, barring the weapons like rockets and things that free fire regardless and just kind of shoot straight forward where you're looking. And so in the later generations, they pseudo kept it in that you wouldn't have as much of the kind of rectangular or square screen to keep them in, but you'd have to kind of keep them centered in your camera. The lock-on was a little bit more forgiving in the later generations, which I think was necessary, especially as we moved into that quicker combat. Having the sort of limited FCS of the first couple generations was definitely limiting. In this one, there's a spot in the trailer that almost looks like you have an, I guess they'd call it an orbital kind of lock-on system akin to like Elden Ring. And so there's speculation that you can lock on completely to an enemy, and then you'll kind of rotate around them, always facing them. And it's hard to tell. We don't really see it from the AC pilot's perspective. It's kind of an external camera. But there's a few times, right when we see the reverse joints kick right before that, and then as well as with that large boss launching on the missiles, a few other times that you see the Armored Core move around them very smoothly facing that specific enemy. And I think it would be interesting. Gameplay-wise, it's always been something that you had to balance, was keeping them in your sights, which of course was difficult, more difficult versus really fast cores, versus, your super lightweights and things like that. So I'm curious if they did implement an actual lock-on system, and it's something where your core turned automatically to face them, if it would be disadvantageous in multiplayer mode for your super lightweights, because that was always something they could do, is they could, dash past you, get out of your lock-on, get behind you, get above you, things like that, and it made it really hard to orientate yourself to them, but it was, kind of an advantage of having such decreased defense and such decreased armor points. Once you got this extra maneuverability that allowed you to get out of that lock-on range. At the same time, with the kind of large boss fights that we have now and these very intentional movements that they have, these kind of intentional choreographed movements, I think it would be beneficial in that respect to have a sort of permanent lock-on that you could kind of rotate around this boss. So there's definitely good and bad. I could see them implementing it. Most of their more recent Souls-type games have had this orbital lock-on system. And so they've had lots of experience with it. They've had lots of experience with making it good, even in a multiplayer aspect, eliminating the problems that might come with it. So I think it's something most likely that we'll see but it's not historically been a thing, so we'll definitely have to wait and see where they land on that one. They've talked about how all of the weapons, and not just the melee weapons, will have very unique behavior, and that they're not just stat-based. It isn't you just pick the rifle with the longer range or the higher attack power, which previously we've seen a little bit of that. We'll see, machine guns or chain guns that might fire in a slightly different way. Shout out to the finger. Way back in some of the old games, you had this thing that sort of looked like a hand, and it was just a 5-barrel machine gun that would unload at a super rapid rate. That would be hilarious to see that come back in. And you've always had unique acting missiles, some, that will launch horizontally, some that will fire vertically, some might shoot out one large missile that then scatters into a bunch of small kind of auto-locking missiles. I think that's where, historically speaking, we've seen the most diversity in firing of a specific class of weapon is definitely among the missiles. A rifle, for the most part, acts like a rifle. There was a little bit of maybe single shot versus kind of burst fire. Or you might see a little bit of difference in, firing rates or accuracy or things on your machine guns, your chain guns, stuff like that. But for the most part, a lot of them acted the same. And so it'd be interesting to see the kind of diversity of this one. I think there's options there, especially with the posture break system, to have things that maybe do less armor point damage and more impact damage to help break that posture. You could have things, like sniper rifles potentially that could have piercing ammo or, really heavy hitting kind of posture breaking impact ammo, things like that. It'll be interesting to see what they do there. Maybe some energy sniper rifles, pulse snipers, things like that. If you couldn't tell, I used to play a lot of sniper rifles as well, but I've dabbled in a lot of things. One thing that I'll be curious about is what kind of types of ammo and types of damage that they'll break this game into. So for the most part, all of your early games had physical ammunition and then kind of energy-based pulse ammunition, which would suck energy out of your generator for firing it, but in exchange you would get a different damage type that a lot of defense stats maybe weren't as good against, or that was just different in a lot of regards, or did higher damage as a trade-off for that energy. And so eventually we also got chemical damage as well, and so it sort of broke it into these 3 different classes of weapons. And so you could make your core very defensive against a specific class, or you could try to spread it out and it would be more of a jack of all trades, but not awesome against any specific type of weapon. And a lot of it came with your weight class as well. So your heavier weights might be better versus physical damage, while your light weights might be a little bit better versus that energy damage, things like that. So it's always been a little bit of a balancing act, especially when they brought in the chemical class as well. And so I'll be curious if they stick with the same ones. I'll be curious if they stick with all 3 or if they go back to just 2. I think with the diversity in weapons we'll see, most likely we'll see more than just the physical and energy. Now, whether that's keeping the chemical class of weapons or if it's changing it to something entirely new, I'm not sure. But I think with as much as they're trying to diversify the weapons, it makes sense to diversify the type of damage that they're dealing as well. And so another thing that they've touched on, that they've confirmed, is that the maps are going to be larger and more complex. Some of your storyline missions might be very quick, just run and destroy this thing or grab this, piece or inspect this place. But a lot of them are also going to be really long, kind of longer drawn out stories as well, which is usually not historically the case. Most of your missions are fairly quick. There's definitely a couple exceptions. But it sounds like this one is going to have kind of built-in save points into the level, which is definitely different. Usually it was a one-off, you start the mission, you either pass or fail. If you stop halfway through, you have to restart it. And so the fact that they're long enough and potentially hard enough to warrant having save points along the way is definitely interesting. I I, for one, am all for it. I love the idea of these big epic boss fights, more akin to, Elden Ring or more of the Souls-like games. And it's not to say that Armored Core has not had big boss fights previously. It has always been a staple of the series. You could say, maybe most of your Soulsborne games are really Armored Core-likes, because there's a lot of aspects such as the staggering, the big boss fights, a lot of, the customization that goes into it. A lot of things have existed prior to the Souls games. So it's not necessarily that Armored Core is a Souls-like. It might actually be the other way around. But I think it's certainly interesting that we're going to get these longer level designs. And I think it makes sense. They've talked about how this one is really heavily single-player focused, which, especially as we're starting to get more new people into the series, I think that was an issue that Armored Core 5 and Verdict Day had, was that a lot of their gameplay, for lack of a better word, was multiplayer focused, especially as you got into Verdict Day and you got, kind of clans or factions, and you would war over certain areas. It was a really good idea, but I think it was one that only worked well with a really large pool of people playing it, which we just didn't have at the time. Armored Core historically has not been something that's been well known or well advertised in the US. Up until 6, most people that I knew didn't even know what Armored Core was, had never heard of it, and that's not super surprising. I do think it's a little bit funny. I mean, obviously, Japan loves its giant fighting robots, but so does the US. I think it's a game series that, had they put a little time and investment into advertising here, would have done really well, but I'm certainly not in that industry, so maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. But I think it's in the same vein as something like Monster Hunter, right? As soon as we got a well-advertised, kind of well-budgeted game here in the US, it took off and did amazing. Now pretty much everybody knows what Monster Hunter is, but it was many, many games into the series before that happened. And prior to that, we might be lucky if we actually got the game released in the US, or we might have to wait, years after it came out in Japan, something like that. But all that is to say, I think it's a good maneuver for AC6 to really focus heavy on the single player, and of course still keep that multiplayer aspect. And they have confirmed that there is multiplayer. They just haven't confirmed what it is. They have talked about not being able to co-op at least the main storyline, potentially any co-op missions. We're not really sure yet. I guess it's possible there's some online exclusive missions that you can do some co-op with. At least your main kind of progressing storyline does sound like it'll be a single-player only experience. And then there'll be some extra online game modes, whether that's just arena, I don't know. I certainly hope that if it is only a versus system and there is only an arena, that they do have a ranked and unranked versions, and so you can kind of climb the ladder, climb the leaderboards. I also hope there's some system in there to make a team and to make, kind of a clan system, even if you're not warring over territory like you were in 5th Gen. I think it would be good, and as well as squad battles, right? So I desperately hope that multiplayer is not just one-on-one. I don't expect it will be. We'll probably see, doubles or squads of maybe 3 or 4 at a time. Bigger than that would be great. But I expect we'll see at least a game type with a couple of ACs versus each other, and not just the single arena combat, though I'm sure that will be an aspect as well. One thing in regards to, not really regards with the single-player mission, but just in the trailers that you see as they talk about somebody using the call sign Raven and kind of flying under a different call sign than who they actually are. So for those of you who are brand new to the series, your first couple of generations, you were Ravens. So the pilots were called Ravens. That was your sort of tag as a mercenary. And then as we moved into the later generations where you get into the whole human plus thing, you were called Nexts. And so your Ravens were the ones who piloted kind of the more old-style cores, I guess, old-style enemies. And you as a pilot were a Next, which means you had these kind of cybernetic augmentations that made you better and made you work with your AC better. And then as we got into even future generations, it eventually became Lynx. And so I'm curious where they'll go with that from just what you're called, right? So are they going to come up with something entirely new? Are you going to be, Lynx or Next or Ravens, or what they're going to do there? I think at this point, maybe they come up with something new, and they might really just lean into the dogs and the hounds kind of aspect that we see in the trailer. And that's something that historically has always been there. You're sort of seen as this, dog of the companies or their lackey, as it were. And I definitely expect we'll see that continue. It's interesting. They talk about, you're one of the infamous handler Walter's hounds. And so where Walter kind of falls into the storyline and how that plays in, I think will be an interesting aspect. But I just thought it was fun that they talk about, somebody flying under the call sign Raven, one that's really a throwback to where it all started, was as a Raven. Some other stuff they've touched on is the kind of customization and tuning aspect of the game, and being able to heavily customize your armored core has always been an aspect of the series, and it's something that they've only expanded on. They've never really decreased your customization options that I can remember. But with that, it's gotten super complex as far as, you go to the garage, you look up a part, and there's just a wall of stats, which is definitely intimidating for a new player. And so they've talked about how, while they're not necessarily lowering the level of complexity and the level of customization, they've made efforts to gradually introduce players to how to use it, to how to read all the stats, to what it means, which I think is great because in previous games, they've done a terrible job of explaining what things are. You sort of just figure it out, you learn from the community. They might go over certain aspects and have a description of what it means, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what it means in practice. It's something that you kind of learn as you go, or you learn from other people or through experimentation. And so I think it definitely is good that they're trying to teach people what all of these statistics mean, what all of these, the things they're looking at, how it affects their gameplay, and how it affects, their individual builds. I think it'll be really helpful for bringing new people into the series and for not overwhelming them right at the beginning. Kind of, again, back to Monster Hunter, it's what they did with World, was they put a lot of effort into advertising it suddenly in the US. They upgraded a lot of the systems, made a lot of things not necessarily less complex, but just smoother, just easier to do before they expanded on it, going into Rise. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic of Armored Core, but I think there's parallels there in the series that have these long histories in another country and these really big kind of followings, either kind of more underground in the US or more in other countries. But it's interesting to see how they release them, and but that is to say that I'm happy that they're making it a little bit more newcomer friendly in that regard. I think it'll do a lot to expand the player base of the series and to kind of have momentum going forward and hopefully into Armored Core 7, which I do think that, they're putting a lot of effort into the world building of AC6. I'm curious if going forward, if they'll try to stick to the same timeline. So assuming that Armored Core 6 actually does well, I'm curious if they'll try to keep it in the same universe, the same timeline, and not jump around like the other games do. Historically, they've usually released your base game, and then they'll release one or two expansions off of that storyline before entirely shifting to a different timeline, a different kind of world, as it were. Which, again, is a very Japanese game design thing to do. They did the same thing with Monster Hunter, in that you'd have your game, you'd get kind of your ultimate expansion of it, and then they would move on to something, not necessarily in a different world, but the mechanics would change and a lot of stuff would change in the following game, which is the same thing that Armored Core has previously done, but I think it might be good for them not to never change anything, but to kind of stick within this one universe, at least for a little while moving forward. Personally, I would like to really expand on the lore, to see returning characters. You know, historically, we would have loved to seen some of the characters come back, like Nine Ball, White Glint, Patch, which I'm just going to say that we had patches before patches was a thing in Elden Ring. I'm just saying, we had Patch the Good Luck patches. It was a thing. Again, Armored Core forming the way for the other Souls-like games, right? But yeah, I think it's just good for a sort of world-building, lore-building aspect if you can really lean into a consistent universe and kind of a consistent timeline. And I'm curious if it's something that they'll do moving forward. You know, Armored Core 6, at least based on pre-sales, seems to be doing really well. I think it hit #1 on Steam in Japan. It's hit top 10 charts, I believe, in several countries. And so pre-sale-wise, I think we are looking pretty good. And of course, coming off Game of the Year, I'm hopeful that maybe people will try it out since it's coming from Software. And so they'll kind of ride that Elden Ring high that everybody had and try out AC6, even if it's not something that they're familiar with. And so a few kind of last-minute notes or things that I wanted to touch on. We do have confirmed that there'll be better training as far as kind of the training and testing room than the previous Armored Cores. Again, helping those newcomers kind of learn the ropes, learn how to fight effectively. So a better training room, and then along with that, we have the arena in the way of the Combat Aptitude Evaluation Program. And so it sounds like we'll be able to go through and fight a lot of the ACs from the main storyline in this sort of arena situation. They did confirm that they'll be harder during the missions than they will be in the arena, but historically it's been something that you can kind of work your way through, earn a lot of money, unlock parts, unlock emblems, things of that nature. Which, just as a quick aside, I'm curious how the emblem editor is going to be on this one. Armored Core has always had the ability to edit your own emblems, your kind of logo, and you can, plant it on your AC. It comes up with your pilot name, things like that. And I feel like the emblem editor has only gotten more and more complex and deep as we've gone on through the series. And so it's definitely something that in some ways I'm hoping they simplify kind of how it works, but don't necessarily lower the depth of which you can customize your own emblem. So really just improvements to the interface of it I think would be great, but I'm definitely hopeful that emblem editing is in the game. There's just no way that they don't, and I'm hopeful that it's a little bit more robust than it has been. And not that it hasn't been previously. I mean, you can make almost whatever you wanted, but sometimes you had to put a lot of effort into it, or you might have very limited layers, and so you had to be kind of creative with how you put things together if you wanted to make a specific emblem. And then another aspect they touched on, I believe, in an interview, is that you can change I think they called it texture in the paint of your Armored Core now. So previously you could always paint kind of colors. You could put on, logos and stickers and things like that if you wanted to. But this one, it sounds like you can actually weather your AC without having to go through the effort of making a bunch of kind of weathered emblems, if you want to call it that. So you can actually weather it. You can change, how kind of reflective and shiny it is. So just adding some texture to the paint as well, I think will be huge. Again, and just customizing your AC, which is why in addition to this wonderful, main single-player storyline I'm sure it will have, I really hope they lean into a lot of multiplayer as well, because, we got to show these things off. And so one kind of last thing that they touch on is that the storyline will have multiple different endings, which again, very, very Souls-like, right? And previously, you might have some of the titles have a couple of alternate endings. For sure, it's not new to the series, but there's been not necessarily limited options in the past. Sometimes you would work your way through, different main storylines, and you would choose to align more with, one company or the other, or, some rebel, something like that. Sometimes even, I guess, what you'd consider good and evil. So it's save these people, or go and, eliminate this camp of dissidents. Or it might be entirely crappy choices on either side, and it's either, kill all of these people or kill all of these people. So historically, there's always been multiple storylines to follow. There's always been multiple endings, so I don't think it's new to the series. But I definitely hope that maybe they expand on it a little bit more, and it changes, a lot of the stuff you see as you progress through the game. Maybe there's linked boss fights to specific storylines, things like that. So it definitely sounds hopeful for replay value, at least. And in the past, Armored Core's never had really a super long, robust main storyline. It's really been about the customization, the trying new weapons, new builds, things like that. And it's not to say there hasn't been a lot of missions, but it's been relatively limited in the amount of kind of straight hours you would get just playing through the mainline storyline, right? So I'm definitely hopeful in that regard, for replayability, for just kind of extra stuff to go in and explore as going through it several times. And I'm curious what that'll look like, I imagine they'll let you keep your same AC and kind of new game plus it and go through, would be my expectation for that. So you don't lose anything, you just kind of finish one storyline, restart from the beginning, and you can kind of go on a different path. I'm curious to see how many diverging paths they will have and what that looks like. If it's just, like 2 or 3 sort of base storylines to work your way through, depending on what you choose earlier, if it really is this complex branching, tree of options and boss fights, part unlocks, things like that you'll have to go through to get everything. Definitely hopeful in that regard. It coming from software, I think it'll be relatively complex as you kind of get to the end to unlock everything, to get everything, and probably quite difficult as well, I imagine. Oh, one aspect of, I imagine, the single player specifically I forgot to touch on is they did mention that you will have repair kits, which is entirely new. Previously, when you went into a mission, there is generally no way to heal yourself as you worked your way through, but I think with the addition of these longer, checkpointed missions, it's something that they had to sort of figure out along the way. So we'll have the ability to use repair kits. I believe they said there's 3 of them, and so it'll be, part of the tactics of figuring out how to work your way through this mission and use the repair kits. The other question might be when you can use them. Is it something you can just use kind of whenever during the mission? Is it something you have to use at a checkpoint along the way? Can you save all 3 for, your big boss fight at the end? How that works? As well as, are they instantaneous, or is it something that's kind of a heal over time? Not something that they've answered just yet. I expect that we won't see them in multiplayer, but it's certainly not confirmed. So who knows? Maybe you have 3 kind of mini healing repair kits in your multiplayer, or maybe it's something you can, equip to your shoulders or your back or something like that and heal yourself along the way. That would be interesting, especially if we get kind of multi AC team on team, squad battles. Is you could have sort of a healer on your team as well, I think would be something very unique and different from the other Armored Cores. I don't expect we'll see it. I expect it's just sort of a single player mechanic, right, to keep you alive as you work your way through these long story missions. But they haven't really expanded on it too much, so it's interesting for sure. And so as we're getting towards the end here and we're starting to wrap this all up, I of course want to cover the pre-ordering of the game. And as I said before, it's been doing really well on pre-sales thus far, has topped, a couple of charts throughout the world. But I think there's a couple of really good things on the pre-order, a couple of good options, as well as, I guess, some issues or some complaints I would have with it as well. And so there's several different options when it comes to pre-ordering the game, and it depends on where you get them from. So most of your kind of higher-end options that have more stuff will come directly from the Bandai Entertainment store, while you can get your more base game models from, the game store or Amazon, wherever you normally order from, Best Buy, things like that. So all of your pre-order edition games will receive the following bonus content: the Melander C3G13 Special Customization Tenderfoot, Melander C3 Parts Set, which is an early unlock, you can unlock it later, an emblem, probably related to the Melander, another early unlock, an exclusive AC decal, which it doesn't say you can get any other way, and they haven't really expanded to what the Melander, special customization Tenderfoot is. It's interesting because they make it sound like the Melander is sort of this base AC, and then you get sort of a special, I don't know what they mean by special customization, or is it different weapons? Is it sort of boosted parts that are very similar but above the kind of starting parts? I don't really know what that looks like, but you will get the Melander Special Customization Tenderfoot for pre-ordering the game. Now, whether that's something that you will immediately stop using 15 minutes into the game when you have a little bit of money to spend, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I hope not. I hope it's something that remains relevant. I do hate pre-order bonus content that becomes, obsolete an hour into the game. Just a small complaint, but we don't really know where this lands just yet. You have your standard editions, which come both digital and physical, so nothing extra, just your standard kind of base game. You have what they're calling the Launch Edition, which is interesting. I've seen it on the Bandai Namco store, but I haven't seen it on every Bandai store. I'm not sure what region it seems to be exclusive to. It might be a US only. But it comes with the base game, a poster, exclusive poster representing an Armored Core, size 390 by 330 millimeters. And so this is actually one complaint I have, in that this Launch Edition has a poster, but none of the collectors or Ultimate Edition or anything past that seems to include it. So it's weird that you would charge a lot more for your collector's editions, which include everything else that these lower editions have, with the exclusion of this random poster that only seems to come with the Launch Edition. And so you'll get 3 art cards depicting the world of Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon, as well as 3 stickers featuring in-game emblem patterns. There is a digital deluxe edition that has the base game, a digital art book, and a digital soundtrack. So nothing physical in this one, all digital, but you do get access to both the art book as well as the soundtrack. So not bad if you're not looking to pick up a physical edition of the game. You have the Collector's Edition, which includes the base game, an exclusive steelbook, a 40-page hardcover art book as opposed to the digital one, a figurine of an Armored Core that's about 19 centimeters tall, a set of 4 pin badges with different in-game emblems, the digital soundtrack, as well as a collection of 45 stickers. And so I definitely like this one. This is the current pre-order that I have, for reasons that we'll chat about here in a second. I definitely like the Armored Core figure, and that's something Armored Core models exist. They do exist, but they're super hard to get a hold of. They're often several $100s, way more expensive, I think, than the typical kind of Gundam models are. And this isn't a model, it's a figure, right? So you're not putting it together. But I've always sort of wanted them, and it's something that the model community doesn't really seem to like. They're highly detailed, but they're made of very fragile plastic. They're very easy to break. They're very easy to mess up putting together. And so it's something I've never spent the money in. I'm definitely excited to have a nice kind of pre-constructed model to pop up on the shelf, right? As well as I'm very happy to have, the art book, the soundtrack, the steel case will definitely look good up on the shelf as well. I do wish it came with the poster, just because. It's not that I have to have an Armored Core poster in my life, but it's just kind of the principle of the thing, right? Why you would have a kind of lower edition and then not include all of the contents of it in your higher editions. And so before I get into the Ultimate Edition, just some kind of quick pricing on everything. So your standard edition, at least in the US, $59.99. The Bandai store in the US in question, now that I'm looking at it, doesn't seem to have the launch edition available, so I don't know if that's going to be like a physical in-store exclusive or where you're supposed to order that from. Some of the Bandai websites talk about it, but then when you actually go to their online store to buy it, it's not available, so I don't know where that's at or how much it's going to be. You have the collector's edition, which is $229.99, so right about $230. So definitely expensive, but you get a lot of bonus content, right? You get the art book, the soundtrack, that figure, which, again, historically, Armored Core models are several $100s. So if it's something that you like, it's something that you're interested in, even though it's a little on the pricey end, I don't think it's that bad for a collector's edition, right? And then we get to, I think I called it the Ultimate Edition earlier. It is the Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon Premium Edition. And so while the Collector's Edition was $229.99, the Premium Edition is $449.99. So we're talking an additional $220 over the Collector's Edition, right? Essentially, an extra $220. We are getting into the price range now where you could almost buy like a PS5 or a different game system for the price of this single game, which is fine. Don't get me wrong. It's, the premium edition probably comes with a lot of extra stuff, a lot of additional things over the collector's edition for those people who want to go above and beyond, right? No, it doesn't. It comes with what they're calling a garage, which is a sort of hanger backdrop for your original model to sit inside of. And don't get me wrong, it looks good, but it's only slightly bigger than the original model. It's got some platforms, some floodlights, and, all the kind of typical mech hanger stuff you would expect. But that's it. That is the only perceivable difference between the collector's edition and the premium edition is the addition of this garage, which again is barely bigger than the model, for $220. I feel like it's outrageous. For that much extra money for this little garage, for $220, I should be able to park my car in this garage, okay? I think just as an additional thing, it's a lot. They could have given us maybe a physical copy of the soundtrack, maybe included that mysterious poster from the launch edition that doesn't actually seem to exist, maybe given us like a little additional like enemy model, backlighting, something. They could have given us something, so we get this little garage for $220. I think it's a lot. I was really on the fence about ordering it. I actually went to, but right when it released, Bandai was having this issue where anybody who tried to buy that edition of the game was getting an error message when trying to process their payment. Saw a lot of people on Reddit and Twitter complaining about it. And then when it was fixed, they were sold out immediately. Now, whether that's due to bots poaching them, which I'm kind of suspect of, or whether they just stopped selling it right then because of the issues, I'm not sure. I haven't actually talked to anybody who's been able to order the premium edition. There is a wait list. I put myself on the wait list in case I decide I want to go for it for all that extra money. Again, we don't have access to a lot of Armored Core merchandise and figures and things, so it's definitely something I would like. I don't know yet if I can justify it or not, but I could pre-order it. I could throw it in the cart and we'll see what happens. But I can't. I can't right now because it's unavailable for pre-order. So again, those are waitlist. But I don't know. I feel like Bandai really messed that one up in regards to, all the people who jumped on it as soon as it was available, and all the hardcore fans who really wanted that edition just weren't able to. There's some error with processing payments, things like that, and then it was just all at once gone. So I don't know. Reach out and let me know. Were you able to get your hands on a premium edition? Do you think it's worth it? Do you think it is outrageous for that price? For an extra $220 to only get, a little edition of the figurine? I still might do it. I don't know. Let me know if you actually see where you can order the launch edition from. Again, I would like the poster. I'm not going to order a whole nother edition of the game just to get like a small poster, but maybe if somebody else is selling it after they get that, I don't know, maybe I'll pick it up just to complete the collection, right? But regardless, that is my thoughts on the trailer and kind of where the game is headed, what to expect in the future, what we've seen so far. So yeah, stay tuned. There's going to be lots of more Armored Core information coming in the next couple of months. I know they plan to talk more about multiplayer, expand on the story, and a few other odds and ends, I'm sure. They've been releasing content kind of every couple of days and various interviews around the world. So I don't know if or when we'll get another trailer. Probably. But stay tuned, as I intend to cover all of the incoming info for Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon, in this podcast, and then move into actual gameplay discussions, builds, things like that. So lots of Armored Core content moving forward. In the meantime, hopefully I'll be over on Twitch, maybe streaming some Armored Core 5, just getting everything ready, right? Getting myself hyped up for Armored Core 6, which will be launching August 25th. So just a couple of months away now.
Oh, looks like it's time to wrap things up. If you enjoyed today's broadcast, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and check out our Discord. You can find me at NoisyWren on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. And if you want to support the podcast, you can find me at patreon.com/NoisyWren. I appreciate the support. Coral is not cheap these days. As usual, the links are in the show notes. Till next time. Connection terminated.